Good morning. Welcome to uh, perhaps one of the more interesting panels that I will ever participate in, I fear. The We have just had an election. Donald Trump not only won the presidency, but he swept both houses of Congress, which means that essentially he controls the entire the executive and legislative branch because the parties have now begun to vote along party lines, and he has in the Supreme Court six uh, very friendly justices of the nine to his actions and to his policies. So this puts us in an interesting position because he's coming to power at a time when the relationship between the Gulf and the United States is particularly fraught. Uh, Israeli airplanes have bombed for the first time a Gulf state, Iran. They Iran has threatened Iran, the largest state in population in an area in the Gulf, uh, perhaps one of the best armed with uh, allies and proxies throughout the region. So this raises some very serious questions as to how Donald Trump and how his administration will deal with an ongoing crisis that already had most of us terribly suffering anxieties and bad dreams at night. We have three very good and very well informed experts today to join us. I will let me just very quickly on the introductions. Most of them need not much of an introduction. Dr. Dania Thafer, PhD from very recently, but congratulations again, and adjunct professor currently at Georgetown University. Sheikh Nawaf El Thani, uh, formerly the Qatari Air and Defense Attaché in Washington, and Dr. Alex Vatanka, the head of the director of the Iran Study Group at the Middle East Institute. Could we just to start off, Dr. Dania, how do you think that Gulf states view the new occupant of the Oval Office?
Thank you, Ambassador Theros, for the introduction. And I'm happy to be speaking at our institute as the executive director on this particular issue. Um, I think something that should be considered when looking at Trump's win is some structural issues that are very important in considering policy when it comes to the region. First and foremost, we're not looking at a Gulf that's the same as the Gulf when Trump left office. Um, right now, things are very different in the region. Uh, Escalation is at a heightened level between Iran and Israel. The Gulf states are in a different state of mind when it comes to addressing regional affairs. And there are concerns about Trump's maximalist policies because the Gulf is not in a maximalist state right now. Um, yes, when Trump took office originally, the Gulf states were fresh out of the Arab Spring. And at that time, they were looking at how they can capitalize on any gains on the different vacuums that happened in the region and cut any losses from that. So they were very maximalist in their approach and how they're looking at Iran and regional issues. Right now is very different. They have cut their losses from the Arab Spring completely, have decided to move on, and are looking forward at their national visions and wanting to focus more heavily on their economic visions, focusing inward. Of course, that's very difficult to do when the region is on the brink of war, but it's obvious that the Gulf states are not looking for any sort of escalation with Iran. Actually, they've now developed closer relations than they ever have in recent history towards Iran collectively. Of course, there's diversity in relations with the Gulf GCC states and Iran. Now, another issue that I would like to address is the fact that the Gulf states, when it comes to Iran, especially, have really lost their confidence in the West and the U.S. And I'll outline to you why, because the West has frankly flip-flopped on Iran so many times, and has left the Gulf states hanging. We can start all the way back to the JCPOA under the Obama administration. There were serious grievances about that deal, especially the fact that they were not consulted or considered enough in the deal. Then there was the withdrawal of Donald Trump, which was supported by some of the Gulf states. Um, but also, while Trump was president, I think that Saudi Arabia, and by extension Gulf states, bitterly remember the lack of the U.S. response when Iran attacked the oil facilities and literally halved Saudi oil production for at least temporarily. Then there was, the Houthi drone and missile attacks on the UAE in 2022. And Saudis obviously have never felt secure with the Houthis being their neighbors, and also experiencing missiles flying over. In all of these circumstances, the Gulf states thought their matters were extremely urgent, and they didn't see reciprocity from the U.S. side, and therefore, I think they're not willing to go along with the U.S. in aggressively addressing Iran. And probably Trump is probably we can argue that Trump will probably apply a very maximalist policy. I think something interesting about Trump when it comes to dealing with the issue of the region is, one, at the same time he wants to contain Iran, and at the same time he wants to not have a regional war, and at the same time he also wants to have a deal with Iran, which I think Alex can probably extrapolate on more than me, since I'm focusing on the GCC states. And so he wants to put maximum pressure with all of this happening. And the Gulf states are not willing to participate in that maximum pressure. I don't see an appetite. I don't think they're going to switch. I know Brian Hook recently made a comment and said that, the Gulf states will probably, if the U.S. pushed forward in deterring Iran, the Gulf states will support the U.S. I mean, I'm sure, they will take a nod at that, but I don't think they're going to risk their national security for that. Another point is looking at the relations with Israel. So obviously, there was movement towards normalization with Israel, but also I think the Gulf states have looked at the recent events in the region and saw, wait a second, Israel is completely militarily dependent on the US, and so are we. And Iran has been, although weakened significantly, um, Iran has been able to hold its ground, and it's right across the Strait of Hormuz. There's a threat from Iran attacking the GCC state where there isn't that much of a threat from Israel. So they've naturally like moved closer to having um, better diplomatic relations with Iran, and also are unsure about how much, in a regional context, I'm not talking about US Gulf relations, normalization with Israel would benefit them in the same way. I think just the view has slightly changed. But aside from that, the elephant in the room is the question of normalization, which has been talked about over and over and has been a hot and cold issue under the Biden administration. The concern about that is, Trump, he's obviously going to try to push forward the Abraham Accords, and we know that undoubtedly, even if you look at his appointees in the administration, all of them are pushing for that same agenda. So that's unquestionable. I think the question remains about a Palestinian state. Well, of course, first and foremost, really, the war needs to stop. The horror needs to stop in Gaza, and I think the Gulf states are in agreement about that. But and Trump says he's gonna somehow bring peace and he's gonna stop the war. So we'll see how he will do that. But there's a disagreement between the Gulf states and Trump, I think, in terms of a Palestinian state. Trump hasn't said anything about establishing a state at all in his rhetoric. The Gulf states have been very clear about that. I think the difference between US policy and Gulf policy right now is that US policy is trying to compartmentalize, the Palestinian cause from the other issues in the region, where I think that the Gulf states are saying no. I mean, the regional security situation right now is linked to resolving the Palestinian issue, and so I think there's disagreement there, and that will be very interesting to see how that moves forward under the Trump administration. Now, in terms of other issues that Trump would be very interested in, keenly interested in, that I think is of mutual interest to the Gulf states, is the AI race globally and digital diplomacy. The Gulf states are very interested in pursuing economic deals and transferring technologies to the Gulf, to be frank. And I think that Trump kind of being that deal maker, that businessman, that he's going to appoint so many people in his cabinet that are from the business communities, will be very interesting to watch about what kind of deals he's going to make with the Gulf states. I presume there are going to be some. Of course, Trump hasn't stated that, but that's just an educated guess. And last, something that I find quite interesting about Trump's policy that I think could have significant ramifications for the Gulf is not really his Middle East policy, but also his energy production policy, his domestic energy production policy. He wants to boost energy production and cut all the red tape associated with any green policies. And so I think he's going to push forward with more domestic production that could affect the hydrocarbon fossil fuel market. But really, I think when you think about his Ukraine policy, where he wants to end the war in Ukraine, and you intersect it together with his domestic fossil fuel policy, there could be ramifications for the energy markets that would not really be good for revenues in the Gulf. And so that is something I think to watch. Obviously, the Ukraine war is a complicated matter, and it also depends on whether Russia's fossil fuels will go completely on market. And it's a very subjective, but it's something interesting to watch, in my opinion.
Sorry, I've not been on mute. I really covered the waterfront, as they say. It is a complicated relationship. Moving to specifically to the relationship with the Gulf Cooperation Council and the United States, and certainly in terms of security, both sides face a really great challenge of how do you maintain peace, stability, and the free flow of energy from the Gulf. Dr. Sheikh Nawaf.
Thank you, Ambassador Theros, and thank you to the GIF for having me today. It is definitely interesting times when we talk about the upcoming new administration of President Trump in his second term. There are four areas where I think we would find interesting when it comes to relationships. And again, I'm going to, as Dr. Thafer did, focus on the Gulf region's relationship with the United States, the security arena, energy and economy, diplomacy, and finally humanitarian, which is now obviously since the war on Gaza and the spreading wars in the region has been a prominent issue and paramount issue for many Gulf states that have, been active in this arena, and how would that affect relationships with the United States? being here right now in Washington, D.C., I've noticed, speaking to former officials from both parties, journalists covering both parties, and even individuals that are monitoring how the elections went. It is clear that the U.S. People gave President Trump a mandate, and looking at the promises that the campaign made and the president made, and how that could be achieved, may be an indication about how the next Trump administration may act when it comes to the Gulf. When it comes to regional security, I think that the cooperation will continue. I think the level of security cooperation that we had in the past is now developing even more because of the war on Gaza, the war on Lebanon, the attacks on a Gulf neighbor, GCC neighbor Iran, and obviously the issues in the Red Sea and Yemen and the Houthis. These are new dynamics that were not prevalent in the last Trump administration. I think that development will continue, that cooperation will continue. We have a visible U.S. presence, as everyone knows, in the Gulf region. We have a U.S. Army Forward Command, U.S. Army Central Forward Command in Kuwait, U.S. Navy Central NAVCENT in Bahrain. Qatar has obviously U.S. CENTCOM forward, which is the commanding organization for all Central Command's forward operations, but also U.S. Air Force Central and U.S. Special Operations Center, all in Qatar as well, and obviously other levels of cooperations and installations in the rest and all of the GCC countries. I think that will continue. I think the GCC is pushing for de-escalation, and therefore that is something that they may find in common with an administration that views itself removed and do not want to continue in the quote-unquote forever wars that previous administration have had, whether in this region or beyond, but specifically in this region. So I think those are areas of de-escalation while maintaining security in the region that the GCC and the United States under a second Trump administration could develop quite robustly even further. The second, as I mentioned, economic and energy. Obviously, there's a long-standing economic and energy partnership with the United States on a corporate level with U.S. energy companies, but also on a state-to-state level between individual and the GCC proper on policies of economic development and energy cooperations with the United States. And I think we've seen, even in the interim Biden administration, between the two Trump administrations, that developed. Certainly after COVID, there was an uptick when it came to developing a lot of those policies and on-the-ground businesses as well. But there's going to be, I think, an interesting twist when it comes to the economic part. While the focus in the first Trump administration vis-a-vis the GCC was investments in defense, while that may continue, I think a new element, and Dr. Thafer mentioned it a minute ago, which is technology, whether it's AI or fintech or medical technology, or looking at a broader technology industry that have been developing in the GCC in the interim years between the two Trump administrations. I think that is an area where new development and cooperation, whether investments from the United States or to the United States, could be something we see. And the third area, I think, that is vital and has been for many decades in the relationship, but I think it's prominent now because of the current situation in the Gulf and in the Middle East as a whole, is the diplomatic cooperation. I think the situation right now in the Middle East is deteriorating immensely. The role that the state of Qatar and the United States has played in de-escalatory diplomacy has been one throughout the years that have been extremely successful. It has been a tough road for both countries to move ahead, and having a new administration on the US side will be interesting to see under that umbrella of no more wars or no forever wars, how would that diplomatic move forward to, for lack of a better word, strike a deal diplomatically for an administration that finds that appealing. I mean, we've seen for instance, the Abrahamic Accords in the first term of the Trump administration. How can that develop into something with more impact and effectiveness? The Abrahamic Accords was a good idea that probably did not achieve the goals because it did not discuss issues of security or did not achieve issues of national security and peace for the countries involved. But probably a more forward-looking model like what we see with Qatar and de-escalatory diplomacy would be something we would see, and I suspect develop even more. Finally, and this is the fourth, and while it's not new, but it's been more important in recent times, humanitarian cooperation. We've seen Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar very robustly providing humanitarian aid with Lebanon and certainly Gaza for over a year, working more and more with the US to find the alternative to kinetic operations or military traditional operations. A alternative to that, which was one would be definitely diplomacy, but the second would be humanitarian. And I think that is an area which we will see more and more cooperation in the coming years. But again, it is early days, and we will see where we go from here.
Thank you so much. That is a really good overview of the GCC, a relationship with the United States. And now we come to the crux of the matter, so to speak. Both of our previous speakers have mentioned Iran as an important element in the relationship between the Gulf and the United States. And Dr. Alex Vatanka, tell us about Iran. How does Iran reacted to the presidency of Mr. Trump, and how do you think things will proceed? It's hard to predict, I know, but still.
Good morning, Ambassador Theros. It's great to be with you, my fellow panelists, and thanks to GFI for inviting me. I'm afraid, I have a feeling I'm not going to be as organized in my delivery of my remarks because I'm trying to capture essentially three different sets of realities: domestic political realities in Iran, political realities facing the new administration in the United States, and obviously realities of the Middle East of today. But let me try and give it a go and see if I can maybe have something useful to tell you in terms of where I think Iran is at the moment. Obviously, as everywhere else in the world, governments are first and foremost sort of waiting to see what will President Trump do in his new administration from January of next year. But I think in the case of Iran, ultimately, really the more important question at least Iranian leaders should be asking themselves at this very moment is not so much what Trump will do, it's what Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, given its 45 years of history with the United States, what it is willing to do. And I think that is the more interesting debate that one has to hope will evolve in the next few days and weeks as everybody waits to see what President Trump might be sort of going in terms of direction. I can tell you that whether the Iranian authorities are willing to talk to him or not, clearly the one person to watch out for here, since this is the most of sensitive issues in the Islamic Republic relations with the United States, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei hasn't commented as much on this topic, certainly not anything that references the notion of talking to the next Trump administration. But people close to Ayatollah Khamenei are sort of suggesting, people like Ali Larijani, who was most recently in the media saying, well, we'll have to wait and see. And I know that's not much, but we have to wait and see in the context of the animosity between US and Iran can actually be seen as a constructive remark. Certainly nothing that is very dismissive. If you want to talk about dismissing the Trump administration, you have to go back to year 2018. We all remember Mike Pompeo at the time, put forth 12 demands of the Islamic Republic in terms of what the Trump administration wanted to see. It really amounted to capitulation of the Islamic Republic, and obviously and unsurprisingly they didn't take it. Right now I'm sure in Tehran they're waiting to see if the 12 points or something similar to that will be put on the table again for Iran to look at and consider, or something much more focused will be perhaps put to Iran to consider. Much more focused meaning nothing that amounts to Iran changing everything in terms of its political nature, but something that is much more transactional, obviously probably most likely related to Iran's nuclear program. So for me, sitting here watching what the Iranian debate looks like, the first question to ask is, will they get over his first term, essentially? Will they get over his first term and his track record from 2017 to 2021? And if they do, and the Trump administration basically puts forward a proposal that, the core of it is, don't weaponize your nuclear program, and we won't be pushing for regime change, there might just be enough platform for some kind of a dialogue. But look, I also want to point out that there's no doubt Khamenei, the person who is most important in this context, he's in a difficult position. He repeatedly has put his neck out and sort of, has made life difficult for himself in terms of the possibility of talking to Trump. I mean, you could criticize Khamenei's position in the sense that he took it very personally, the way Trump went about speaking about Iran, both as a candidate in 2016 and then the sort of things he ended up doing as president. He famously, refused to have anything to do with Trump. President Trump at the time sent the Prime Minister of Japan all the way to Tehran with a message, and Khamenei made sure that the cameras were on when he said, "I will not talk to that man." He made sure that President Hassan Rouhani in France did not get the green light from the Supreme Leader's office to have a meeting with Trump. So there were a lot of sort of opportunities missed. But going forward, again, two basic realities are confronting the Islamic Republic, and hopefully will shape their calculations in a way that helps towards de-escalation in the region. One really is to get rid of this notion that it doesn't matter who sits in the White House. It's sort of an old slogan of the Islamic Republic. It does matter who sits in the White House. And surely by now the Iranians know that there's a difference between the President Obama that signed the JCPOA 2015 and the President Trump that introduced the maximum pressure campaign in 2018. And right now they have to wonder if there is a middle ground, if there is a way they can, perhaps, as I said, put the bad blood behind them and look for a practical way forward with the Trump administration. Nobody's going to, this is not going to be a love fest of any kind. But Iran right now is in a pretty bad situation in terms of its economy, but also in terms of where it is in the region. It has suffered pretty significant blows in recent weeks and months at the hands of Israel, backed by the United States. So for the Iranians, the second reality is if there is a return of a maximum pressure campaign, are they in a position to deal with it? They are saying that they are in a position to deal with it. That in fact, they think the maximum pressure campaign that might be introduced by the next Trump administration cannot look anything as vicious as the first maximum pressure campaign because of so much has changed. Above all, I think the Iranians don't think China will help the United States. And since 90% of Iran's oil goes to China, that is the critical factor that I think they believe is on their side. But overall, I would also say in terms of two things I would point out that hasn't changed for better for Iran. One is they are further away from the Europeans because of Iran's support for Russia in Ukraine, and the idea of snapback sanctions that Europe rejected when Trump was last president, they might not reject it next time around, just because the Europeans are that much more irritated with Iranian policies, particularly over their close ties with Russia. And then the final point I probably make, since I'm almost coming up for my allocated time, is while it is true President Trump elect has said he's not interested in any new wars in the Middle East or anywhere for that matter, what you have to wonder is perhaps a concern in Tehran, and it ought to be, is while President Trump is not willing to do anything similar to, say, 2003 invasion of Iraq that President Bush did, that doesn't mean he can't, as an American president, free space up or open the hands of the Israelis to sort of essentially take the fight to Iran. Iran and Israel are essentially at war today as we sit here and speak. There's a lot of reporting, probably all of it true or most of it true, that the Biden administration did hold Israel back. Now, going forward, the Iranians surely are thinking that might not be the case anymore, and the Trump administration might give not only blessing, but also the military requirements needed for Israel to seriously hurt the Islamic Republic. Again, let me just wrap up saying de-escalation surely is not just in the interest of Iran, but also perhaps the Israelis. And the question I think we have to sort of ask is, will Iran be able to, and I think this is probably the toughest one, will they be able to have a way of communicating with Trump without the photo opportunity? Because that's what President Trump wants. He wants the sort of North Korean style, I brought Iran to the table. I delivered. This is not going to work with the Iranians, but there might be a way for the two sides, Washington, Tehran, in the next few months to sort of tone it down, where Iran, certainly the person of Ali Khamenei, cannot be seen to be personally humiliated by having to sort of essentially bite the bullet. But let me stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. You actually paint a rosier picture than I have. It's sometimes the possibility of next relationship. Let me ask one thing. Europe has clearly panicked over the election of President Trump. They've had two meetings where they're now everyone in Europe, in one way or another, is saying Europe has to grab control of its own future. Europe has to be less dependent on the United States for security guarantees. Europe has to worry individually about Ukraine because it's not the U.S. If Trump does what he says he's going to do, the U.S. is going to let the Russians get their pound of flesh in Ukraine. So all these things have driven European, at least the sense in Europe that they need to sort of unify their policies. Do you sense anything similar in the Gulf, particularly in the GCC? Is there any indication within the GCC that the GCC all have a common interest, which is to stay out of war? This is given. So then the question is, are they actually thinking about that? Are they working in that direction or not? And I'll leave that to anybody who volunteers the question. No volunteer.
I can volunteer.
Okay.
Well, interesting question. You're right. The Europeans are very concerned about Trump's win, and I think rightly so. And interestingly enough, when you look at even the Europeans' approach to the GCC, it has changed. They have now appointed an envoy to address the GCC, Luigi De Maio, and he's done a great job actually in bringing together the GCC and engaging on key topics of interest for them. And I think that's noteworthy. And I think that's also a way in which the Europeans are trying to distinguish themselves from the US. I know I've been in some discussions in Europe talking about GCC policies, and I've always noticed in the room, they certainly haven't included Americans in these discussions. And when I asked why, they're like, oh, because they're going to take all the oxygen in the room. So I do think that the Europeans are looking elsewhere. But I know your question was about the GCC. In terms of the GCC states, still, no matter all of their strategic hedging and their engagement and their newfound strategic autonomy after the Ukraine war, they are obviously diversifying their relations and focusing heavily on regional integration, and not necessarily the vision that the US has for regional integration. And so they are diversifying their relationships, trying to shield themselves from risks or de-risking their situation by engaging Iran. That's an example, and also all the reconciliation that happened throughout the region. There's an ongoing truce between the Houthis and the Saudis. But let's be real. I mean, the U.S. Gulf relation, even with all of that happening, is strong, and it's here to stay for the near term. The GCC states have strong economic interests, but also security interests with the U.S. And with all the backdrop of everything going on, that still hasn't changed that relationship. And so yeah, there has been change, but it's not to the extent that would tip the balance.
Thank you. Going on, I'm going to take the advantage of being moderator before I turn to other questions. One party that we have mentioned only in passing in this discussion has been Russia. Yes, Russia is caught up in Ukraine, but Russia is clearly cultivating a much deeper security relationship with Iran, which also builds upon Russia's position in OPEC Plus, where if the United States begins to pump oil like mad, oil and gas from fracking, this is going to drive prices down. The last time they did this, the Saudis and the Russians led a campaign to push prices even lower, knowing that the fracking companies have expensive production costs and that about $50 or $45 a barrel, they go out of business. And Iran is now a key supplier of military equipment to Russia, to the war in Ukraine. Russia has interest. Recently, there was a Russian, Iranian, Chinese naval exercise in the Indian Ocean. So does anyone see Russia trying to pick up a role here, given at least Putin's apparent bromance with Trump in the past administration? Where are we going on this, and how does Russia affect the region? Sheikh Nawaf, any thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Pastor. I'm sorry, I didn't know it was for me. Well, Russia is an important country, obviously, for the region's stability in the past, and it is a close ally for many of the Gulf nations, namely Iran, obviously. Now, there are countries like the GCC that predominantly have the defense relationship solely with NATO nations, namely the United States of America. But definitely Russia has been in the Middle East before, diplomatically and militarily, in supporting the regime in Syria during the heightened part of the Syrian civil war. Currently, obviously, Russia's preoccupied with the war in Ukraine. We've seen reports about the support that they're getting from Iran. What are the limitations of that support? How effective is that support? It's unclear. Issues of drones and notwithstanding, there are more strategic capabilities obviously in play that is unclear how Iran affects that area. I know the GCC country has made it extremely clear that they don't want a forever war zone in the Middle East. They do not see a continuation or escalation of violence from any party as the way forward. They also are very clear on the issue of occupation of areas of Ukraine, that it should end, but it should end diplomatically and not militarily. And I think looking at the current U.S. administration, at least, the future, U.S. administration, a second Trump administration, at least by the claims that they're making, that they are not for more wars in the region, we've yet to see if those claims will actually happen. I think looking at all of that is we could deduce at least more cooperation in finding de-escalatory approaches to probably peace in the Ukraine. That is a cooperation between Russia, one or more countries in the GCC, and the United States as sponsors of a future peace. That is a probability. It's very difficult to see how it can get from here to there today, but I'm sure within the coming weeks and months, those outlines will be fleshed out more, and we could make a better assessment. 3 days removed from an election and a couple of months from inauguration, it's extremely difficult to pontificate and to read the crystal ball about how will the second Trump administration behave in the Middle East. But obviously, and vis-a-vis Russia as well, when it comes to the GCC and its concerns for de-escalatory approaches in the Middle East and beyond. But I think looking at those threads in policy through the campaign, we may deduce that this may be an opportunity, a good opportunity, surprisingly, to move forward, to bring down the tempo, and hopefully have a more stable region and a more stable hemisphere when it comes to the US's view of no more forever wars.
If I could just quickly add on Iran, if I may, just because this issue of Russia is so much in the news, this closer Russian-Iranian relationship. And there's a chance that by end of this year, Iran and Russia will end up signing another strategic so-called agreement. But let me quote the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, who said at the BRICS summit in Kazan in Russia recently that, he was hoping that these Iran's membership in groupings like the BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that are dominated essentially by Russia and China and might very well take an anti-Western, anti-US tilt, even though they're saying that's not the aim. But for Iran to be a member of these organizations, as Pezeshkian said, it can't just amount to, sitting at a nice conference hall and exchanging pleasantries. The Iranians are looking for real material support. And it's very obvious Russia can deliver what they need. Russia itself being as sanctioned as it is. But when Russia wasn't sanctioned, if I go back to the last time Iran and Russia had a strategic agreement, I think it was Mohammad Khatami in 2001 that signed it, and it was 20 years in duration. And if you look at the 20 years when this last strategic agreement was in play, what actually happened in terms of fundamental change in relations? Both or on economic fronts, on military fronts, so forth. And there is this suspicion in Iran that Russia doesn't have the deep interest in cultivating the sort of what Iranian regime side wants to be strategic ties. The Russians don't have that interest. They're certainly not going to pursue that kind of a policy at the expense of their other interest in the Middle East. And we saw the Iranian anger just a few days ago when Israel struck Iran. The Iranians were openly saying, why the silence from Moscow? Where are you? Why are you not condemning it? The Gulf states were much quicker to condemn Israel than this so-called strategic friend of Iran, Russia, was. So there are a lot of reasons for us to be skeptical when we hear some of these announcements come out of Tehran and Moscow about the great sort of ties that are happening. And measure that against actual change. I think deep down in the Islamic Republic, even supporters of the Islamic Republic have deep reservations about, Russia and how Russia has always played Iran as a card to get what it wants from the United States, from Europe, and has often been happy to, Iran left disappointed because Iran is just not that important for them in the bigger, policy objectives that they're pursuing around the world.
Interesting. One of the things that makes me sort of a little more optimistic or not is Trump's repeated rhetoric on "I don't like wars. Wars are bad. They're bad for business," and a couple of instances where where he was pushed towards war. One of them being the shoot down of an American reconnaissance drone in the Arabian Sea. Other ignoring the Iranian attack on Ebcake, ignoring the Arabian response to the killing of Soleimani. All these things indicate that Trump has his limits too. And I also wonder just how much he can really turn up the screws further. He keeps talking about maximum pressure. I talked to Trump supporters here in the United States who say that Biden loosened the maximum pressure on Iran. I don't see that much of that really happened. How does anyone believe that there is really much left in maximum pressure that could be brought on Iran?
I'll be going first, if you don't mind, very quickly. As I pointed out in my remarks, China is obviously key here. And we are sitting here talking about a new American president who wants to make China suffer. Tariffs are being discussed and so on. So the idea that China is going to help in any way, the American plan to bring back the maximum pressure, I shouldn't say I don't see it happening. I just think it's going to be very difficult. I mean, there was a report in the Wall Street Journal today saying the Trump administration is already looking at which ports in China to sanction or threaten to sanction in order to stop the 1.7 million barrels of oil that goes there, 90% of Iranian exports. Are they going to be able to do that? I don't know. But from what I can tell, and I'm certainly not a China watcher, but this is a very different moment, 2024 than 2016, and the Chinese are getting Iranian oil as, from what I understand, a pretty nice discount. They're making money out of it. They're making a geopolitical point out of it, saying to the United States, "You don't tell me who I can buy oil from." By the way, Iran is not under international sanctions right now. So again, there are a lot of reasons for me to wonder about the maximum pressure. But on the very quickly on the issue of war, you're absolutely right. This is a president that has made it very clear he doesn't want war. In fact, I mean, if we believe J.D. Vance is the future of the Trump movement, he's more articulated the idea of being against wars, not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere too. So that's the future of the Republican Party. But that doesn't mean that someone like, say, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel cannot convince Trump and say, you know what we did with Qasem Soleimani in January 2020? We can do that 50 times over across Iran. We can decapitate the Islamic Republic, just going after the leadership. You don't have to worry about sending 300,000 American troops to the region. It's going to be a very different war, and you'll be the hero out of it. That is, I think, what some of the voices around President Trump-elect will tell him, that it's going to be a very different war, and the whole region will be fixed in one big go as long as it's focused on the mothership, that's the Islamic Republic. Again, I don't know who's going to win that policy battle in a Trump inner circle between those who are against the forever wars and those who are saying, just this last war, please, and then we're done.
Interesting. I had thought, that was some of the policy objectives open to Netanyahu, is I can keep the war going if I give Trump a big enough prize, which leads me I got to stop asking my own questions, but leads me another one. We've got 2.5 months left of the Biden presidency, but it's still the Biden presidency. He's still president. Does anyone believe that Biden might, at this point, decide that he no longer has any political reasons for keeping Netanyahu happy, and how this could affect the Gulf if Biden decides to stop military supplies to Netanyahu? How does that affect the Gulf? How does that affect the Gulf attitudes towards the future?
That's a good question. I know when you talk to the Biden administration and you ask them about his policy towards Gaza and towards the region, most people respond, say it's Biden. It's completely at the top. Biden is bent on this policy, and so I'm not sure how much of that you can disentangle it from him feeling constrained versus his personal view on how to continue this. So I'm not sure how he's going to react in the next couple of months in terms of stopping the war. I know that there was a release about giving a 30-day notice to Israel. But every time, I don't know, historically, when you looked at all of the notices that Biden gave forward and the red lines gave forward, they were almost like green lights. And so it's really hard to project what's going on. I know that Trump has signaled to Netanyahu that he needs to finish. So I think Trump is not going to tolerate the continuation of a war. I don't know if he can possibly make that happen. But so it might be the other way around. It might be that Netanyahu escalates in the next couple of months before Trump comes into office.
That's also a problem that should keep people up at night worried. Uh, Let me turn to some of the other questions coming in. On the bilateral relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States in the previous Trump administration, uh, it was clear that Trump was moving towards this idea that uh, Saudi Arabia is my country. Saudi Arabia is the country I'm going to deal with most. Uh, this is my entry, and tried to deepen the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, oftentimes at a bit of sort of presenting a confused picture to other countries in the GCC as to whether they could count on Trump in a disagreement with Saudi Arabia or where they fit in this. Uh, do you think a return to that sort of policy is possible, where Saudi Arabia becomes the keystone of Trump's relationship to the Gulf?
I'm sorry, can you reframe the first half
Yeah,
of the question?
under Trump, slowly Saudi Arabia became the country he talked to most in the Gulf, the country that he was most interested in 4 years ago in the Gulf, and building a relationship, largely transactional. I mean, business relationships and so forth. And at times, we heard from other Gulf countries a certain amount of concern that the American relationship under Trump was more Saudi centric. Or is that just an impression that I'm wrong about?
Well, if I may,
You may.
gentlemen. Okay, well, that's a good question. I do think Washington in general has been very Saudi and UAE centric. Um, and, you have to say, once Israel comes a question or a question as being part of the picture, the attention in Washington shift towards those countries. And actually, if you read most of the analysis about Gulf relations with Trump, it was highly focused on Saudi and UAE relations. And even if you listen to the interlocutors in the legislative branch in Congress, there's a huge focus on Saudi, especially right now. And let's not forget that Trump's first visit was to Saudi Arabia. And so it's not surprising, or it wouldn't surprise anyone to see if that when Trump moving forward, he's going to emphasize on Saudi Arabia. Um, and the Saudis have been back and forth with the Biden administration about a deal, and now there's even talk of a mega deal. They've been hot and cold, hot and cold, hot and cold, and I think they're in the process of negotiating and really wanting, in the end, to see what they can get out of Trump in terms of a deal. But normalization is a very difficult question with the ongoing Gaza war and regional instability, and also Gulf publics are also on edge about everything that's going on and the violence. And so normalization is a difficult question. The cost for normalization is much higher. And, all of the Gulf states, even the UAE, agree about a Palestinian state is incredibly important, and are using their leverage in different ways to push for that. The UAE has said, we're not going to get involved in any post-war initiative unless there's a Palestinian state. They've said that. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how Trump deals with the Gulf states, because one thing I know is very clear about his foreign policy is going to be all about building on the Abraham Accords. I mean, just even looking about his potential appointees in his cabinet, it's going to be all about that. And so Trump sees himself as a deal maker. He's going to try to push a few buttons here and there to move things forward, but I'm not sure how it's going to resonate.
You raise, Dr. Dania, you raise a very interesting question. Uh, all of the Gulf states, and some more publicly than others, have said, as you did, that there is not a question of any participation in the rebuilding and rehabilitation of Gaza beyond humanitarian aid, unless there is a Palestinian state uh, in the guaranteed future. Trump, and I personally believe that I think Trump will try to bring the war to an end if Biden doesn't bring him to it. I'm on that particular subject. I'm rather optimistic. Uh, Trump is then going to have to figure out a way to persuade the Gulf states to because the Israelis, regardless of who's president or prime minister at the moment, the Israelis, there's nothing in the Israeli body politic that would permit a Palestinian state to be created, at least in the foreseeable future. Trump will be looking for ways to get the Gulf states to participate in the rehabilitation. Otherwise, the U.S. is stuck with the bill. The Israelis won't, and in fact can't. It would bankrupt Israel to try and rehabilitate Gaza without American help. So, is there a chance that there would be sufficient pressure brought on the Gulf states to participate in the rebuilding and rehabilitation of Gaza without a Palestinian state, or has that train left the station and it's not possible? Sheikh
If
Nawaf?
I may take that, yes, thank you. Well, I think that's prematurely put, Ambassador. I think most GCC countries would look at it and say, we're looking at it on the wrong angle. There are many steps that should come before the question of footing the bill. The question of the day after is a humanitarian crisis. The question of the day after is an issue of self-determination. What are the governance structure that a healthy society, anywhere in the world, and the Palestinians should be an exception, made out of, and how can we support that? And then the question of rebuilding and how that is structured and what the international community's role and responsibility, to include the United States, to include Israel. You break it, you own it, you fix it. It shouldn't change when it comes to geopolitics either. So that is a long process, but it should start at the beginning and not at the end. And I think the beginning is obviously ending this crisis, dealing with the humanitarian aid, and discussing something that we shouldn't be discussing in the 21st century, let alone 2024, of self-determination for a people. That is, at this point, the international community, to include the GCC, are ready to move forward and beyond, and thinking about financial issues at this point is putting the horse ahead of the cart. And I think most countries are not interested in doing this the other way around or backwards, but moving in a healthy way. I think the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, will be interested in deal making. That is, I think, if we see the first administration as an example, is proof. How that is done, I think there are different methodologies. We've seen the Abrahamic Accord. I've yet to see the positive effects of the Abrahamic Accord. I may be mistaken. I doubt I am. But why repeat the same thing twice and expect a different result? I don't think that will be the move forward. On the other hand, you have proven track records. Like, for instance, and this is just an example, obviously, Qatar's mediation skills and agility to reach a deal. I think that then becomes an interesting makeup or connection, where you bring in the need from a U.S. administration to have a deal done to reach a peaceful resolution, and then having a country with the tools and the know-how and the expertise, and frankly, a successful track record in getting deals done towards peace through mediation. That then becomes interesting. But who pays for rebuilding Gaza, while absolutely important, is not the first question nor the first answer, I think.
Which brings us back to oil policy and gas policy. If the United States follows through on Trump's promise to dramatically increase oil and gas production. I don't know how technically feasible that is, but it's certainly quite possible. How do you think the Gulf states would react to that? And we're talking now about purely the economic side rather than the political.
If that's for me, then I think clearly there is a capacity to U.S. energy markets. We cannot expect the U.S. energy market to increase capacity overnight. Frankly, you need refineries, you need drillers that are all finite. You need manufacturing to support that. So turning off and on a switch to produce a capacity that has a different effect on the global market doesn't happen overnight. The U.S. has been energy independent while still importing a lot of oil from the world, which is a conundrum for most Americans, as I found out being here in Washington in the past few weeks. But that is an economic reality. The GCC's market is not very distinct, but distinct enough that it doesn't cross or butt against what the U.S. views as the European foreign market as its primary area for energy, namely shale gas and liquid natural gas or LNG. Although many GCC countries now are expanding towards Europe. Qatar, for instance, after the Ukraine war and the pipeline disruption with Russia to Germany, has now begun to develop more and more into Europe when it comes to economic. I think the markets are open and ready for more competitors there. I don't see a crossover that affects neither the US or the GCC. And finally, one of the most important things people don't recognize, in many projects, whether in the US, in the GCC, or joint projects in other places, are in many cases joint ventures between US companies and Gulf companies. So it's not that defined US and GCC, but in many cases, these are business interests that have been very successful, and I doubt anyone would do anything to disrupt them.
Which brings us to the other side of the oil markets. Until now, the entire world seemed determined to pursue, to one degree or another, decarbonization. How do we, most of the world, except for apparently the Republican Party in the United States, believes that climate change and global warming is a reality. And the individual GCC states have actually, how can I say, invested a considerable amount of time, money, and thinking into how do they deal with decarbonization. I don't know just how long Trump can maintain the facade that it doesn't exist, and this is just a Chinese hoax or something. But does decarbonization, is it deep in the minds of the GCC states, or is it something that was just pretty much let me figure out how to make my critics happy? And if so, how does that, if the United States reverses course on decarbonization, does the GCC continue in its present course, or does it go in another way?
Well, I think either way, the GCC states are gonna move forward on trying to hedge against the ramifications of the movement towards a climate friendly fossil fuel policy. And one way they're hedging against that is developing different kind of green technologies and investing and innovation led development that focuses on these industries. And I think they will continue to do that whether Trump is in the White House or not. And also, I think the GCC states view their fossil fuel resources to be more climate friendly than fossil fuels globally. And I think they're going to continue marketing that and pushing that forward. And so I don't think that Trump is going to change their policies when it comes to climate issues or their emphasis on it. But of course, I think at the same time that Trump's, you know, continuous respect to the fossil fuel industry could be something viewed positively in the Gulf. And even he's pushing forward. I think another issue is to continue fossil fueling and continue drilling and all of that, which is much more costly than it is in the Gulf for climate reasons and actually monetary reasons. And I think that's also another point that I think the Gulf states will push forward, that their fossil fuels are more climate friendly. But I don't see a substantial change in their policies based on Trump's perspective on addressing or not addressing climate issues.
Turning to Iran once again, I keep being bombarded at home with notices from different sort of Iranian exile organizations. And one theme that seems to be coming out is that the Trump administration coming down hard on the Islamic Republic may actually be able to rouse popular opposition to the Iranian Republic and even affect climate change. I don't think, I mean, climate change, affect, that was a bad transition, affect regime change. But I don't think regime change is in the offing. But how much do you think, Alex, that the Iranian population would seek regime change under U.S. pressure?
Tough question. I mean, to be honest, all I can tell you are the obvious facts is that the policies of the Islamic Republic inside of Iran and clearly in the diaspora are so deeply resented. I mean, you cannot point to a moment in history where the ruling class in Tehran have distanced themselves so much from the people that they are ruling over. I mean, we have come to a point when the Israelis are striking Iran, and it hasn't happened since the Iraqis did in the 80s, that a good part of Iranian society is essentially cheering for Israel. This is not Israel's doing. This is not America's doing. This is about how the Islamic Republic, the rulers, essentially have for so long ignored the basic demands of their people. Now, will these people be able to rise up? Will they do it if President Trump picks up the phone and says, I want you to rise up? I think there you will find a lot more skepticism on the part of the Iranian people. They dislike, from every metric I can point to, they dislike the authorities because of their policies. But at the same time, they respect the authorities for the ability to crack down to stay in power. And we've seen that in recent years in numerous of protests that have been essentially repressed. And people essentially don't have a high threshold for pain or certainly not death. So you've seen that in the numbers. Iranians pack their bags and leave the country, not because they want to, because they don't want to die for political change and they don't want to live under the Islamic Republic. So I don't know. I have not seen anything that suggests to me that the Trump administration will have a grand strategy in terms of what to do with Iran. And if you're going to get people's attention in the opposition in Iran or in the diaspora, you need to prove to them that you're credible, that you're not using them as a pawn in a way of pressuring Tehran to give you what you want, and then you'll throw the opposition under the bus. That's going to be the challenge for folks like Brian Hook and others who are being mentioned as leading contenders to occupy senior positions in the State Department, who have spent a lot of time in the last Trump administration, working out what their Iran policy is. You can't have an American president who says, on the one hand, I will bring this Islamic Republic down, and then the following day he'll says, let's talk. Let's see if we can cut a deal. There's been a lot of confusion in the first term Trump administration in terms of how serious he was on Iran and the actions he took. I have to point out. I mean, from the maximum pressure campaign to the killing of Qasem Soleimani to listing the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, as the terrorist organizations, what they all had in common was they were essentially low cost for the United States. It didn't take American blood and treasure to implement those policies. The pain was on Iran. But we're talking about grand strategy. We're talking about changing the regime in Iran. That you can't do as a transactional process or on the cheap. That requires a lot of thinking, a lot of effort. And I just don't see that, not just in the Trump administration. We didn't see that in the Biden administration. I don't think the United States as a country anymore has any appetite for nation building or regime changes. And certainly a country the size of Iran with some 90 million people, that's a major undertaking. So I as much as I wish tomorrow you will have a political system in Tehran that reflected the wishes of the Iranian people, that has to sort of come because of realities in Iran. It could be the death of Ali Khamenei. He's 85. That might be a moment for change in Iran. But I just don't see any American administration, Republican, Democrat, or any foreign power essentially being able to sort of instigate that. They can help the process once it starts rolling, but I don't know if they can actually start it. Let me stop there.
I'm the only person in this panel who's old enough to remember as an adult the Islamic Revolution and how it transpired. And one obvious observation from that time was that we didn't know anything about what was really going on inside Iran. I mean, we knew what the newspapers were reporting, we knew stories, we knew what the Shah was telling us, because we weren't talking to anybody in the opposition. Partly because we didn't believe it was possible, partly because Kissinger had forbidden American intelligence from talking to them. So this isn't a question. I'm just tossing out the thought that we really don't know what's going on in Iran, and we wouldn't be very good at starting up a revolution. We only have a few minutes left. I'd like to ask each of you to close a certain question. At the end of the Trump administration, in 4 years, will he have benefited the Gulf, and if so, how much? So we can start with same order, Dr. Dania.
That's a big question, and could be very speculative because right now the region is so volatile and it's in a tumultuous state that there could be so much change. I mean, so much change has happened in the last 4 years. But I think it depends on what Trump decides to do. What is he going to do in the Gaza war? How's he going to deal with Iran? And is the region going to be more stable than now? These are all major question marks that I wish I could answer. If he can do, he said that he wants to implement peace through strength. I think defining that is when he defines that more clearly, we could probably have better answers for you.
Sheikh Nawaf.
Well, I share Dr. Thafer's view that it's a very broad question and maybe a bit early, but I mean there are fundamentals that we could look onto and back on. One of the main fundamentals being that those who more benefit or will be of benefit to the Gulf are the Gulf states themselves. That's the end of the road. At the end of it, neither the U.S. or any country will be as beneficial to the Gulf states than the GCC to themselves, looking at their own national interest, looking at more cooperation, and looking at stability in their own region and doing what they can to achieve all three. But if we look on just the U.S. view of would they be good to the Gulf? Well, the main processes of moving in diplomacy, as you know, sir, dictate that your national interests come first. And if the U.S., if President Trump, as we look at the election today, would be good for American national interests, that then in the long run will be good for the Gulf, because national interest would dictate no more instability in the Middle East, no more wars, and forever wars, as it is called, stable energy markets, flourishing investments and economy. Now that may be wishful thinking, but all things being equal, I think in the end, what benefits more the Gulf states are the strong relationship which are initiated by the Gulf states themselves, and the countries and the peoples of the Gulf states working for their own interest. Other than that, at least we should wait till the inauguration, Ambassador, and then maybe we'll have some idea about where we're going.
Okay, thank you. And Alex, you get to wrap it up with a question that probably has no answer, but I'd like you to try anyway.
Thank you, Ambassador. My colleagues have done such an excellent job sort of focusing on the Gulf states. If I could just broaden out very quickly, I would just suggest for the Trump administration coming in, really not just think in terms of transactional, approach to the region. If the Middle East today is sort of seeing two forces battling it out, let's just call one of them Abraham Accords, regional integration, acceptance of Israel, and then let's call the other one the rejectionist camp led by the Islamic Republic. These are the two main challenges. And really, I mean, my colleagues have done a wonderful job describing this necessity of dealing with the Palestinian issue. President Trump will find out that, that's the elephant in the room. You cannot have the Abraham Accords expanded while you support, perhaps, say, some of the more extreme policies of Israel, for example, in terms of settlement in the West Bank. So on. That's just not going to happen. You gotta choose which mission you have in mind. If you want the Abraham Accords to be expanded, the region to integrate, hopefully on the sort of closer U.S. ties, because Russia and China are sitting on the sidelines and waiting to take advantage of America messing things up. If the United States is focused on that, and by the way, that's when you have to also see what you want to do with your Iran policy, because you can't leave Iran out there. One way or another, you have to come up with an Iran policy. Either you deal with the Islamic Republic, as some of the supporters of President Trump want, in terms of regime change, whatever that means, or you give Iran a reason to take a different direction forward. But these two issues are connected. The issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and where Iran is in the region. And they're taking the rest of the region hostage, a region that by and large wants to focus on economic development, integration, looking at the post-oil era. They're looking for the sort of deliver for their populations, good governance, all the rest of it. And they really, if the United States can help the region not be taken hostage by these two, as I said, forces, then and he's not going to succeed in 4 years. That's not enough time, but he can start that process. And really, that would be a major achievement should he be able to focus his mind on that kind of a agenda.
Well, thank you all very much. If we can sum it up, most of us are worried about Trump. Most of us are also believe that there is a possibility that Trump's policies over the next 4 years could in fact benefit the region. Thank you all. It's been a great panel, and we look forward to seeing you in the next Gulf International Forum discussions. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.